December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It is a perfect tropical Sunday morning. The air is warm, smelling of salt water and hibiscus. The sky is a flawless, impossible blue. Along the eastern edge of Ford Island, the titans of the U.S. Pacific Fleet are asleep. 7 battleships, moored side by side in the shallow, oily water of Battleship Row. They are monuments of steel and arrogance. The USS Arizona, the USS Tennessee, the USS Maryland, and, moored outboard of the Tennessee, is the USS West Virginia, a 33,000-ton behemoth, a fortress of the sea. Deep within its steel belly, two-year-old Doris "Dory" Miller is collecting laundry. He is a mess attendant, 3rd class. His battle station, if the ship ever goes to war, is in the magazine, below the waterline. His job, to pass ammunition up to the real fighters. What Miller does not know, what no one knows, is that 4,000 yards away, a Japanese B-5N Kate torpedo bomber is lining up its run. Screaming in at just 40 feet above the water, slung beneath it is a Type 91 torpedo, and 1,800-pound cylinder of steel, explosives, and genius. Dory Miller is not a gunner. He is not a naval officer. He is not a strategist. He is a ship's cook. And in the next 10 minutes, he is about to do something so impossible, so forbidden, that it will shatter the very rules of the United States Navy and change naval history forever. To understand what happened on that bloody Sunday, you must first understand the man who planned it, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was a gambler, a man who understood America better than America understood itself. He had studied at Harvard. He had been a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. And he knew one terrible truth. In a long war, Japan could not win. America's industrial might was a sleeping giant. If that giant ever woke up, it would crush Japan. Yamamoto's entire strategy was based on one insane gamble. Not to win a long war, but to win the entire war. In a single morning, he proposed a plan so audacious, so suicidal, that his own naval general staff called it insane. A 4,000-mile radio-silent journey across the hostile North Pacific. A secret armada of 6 aircraft carriers, the Kido Butai, to launch a surprise attack and annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one devastating blow. But there was one massive, impossible problem. It wasn't the 4,000-mile journey. It wasn't the risk of discovery. It was the water. This is where expert consensus failed the Allies. The U.S. Naval Command in Hawaii was complacent. Why? Because Pearl Harbor is, on average, only 40 feet deep. 40 feet. A torpedo dropped from an aircraft in 1941 needed at least 75, often 100 feet of water to plunge, stabilize, and arm itself. In a 40-foot harbor, a standard torpedo would simply dive straight into the mud. Pearl Harbor, the experts declared, was torpedo-proof. They had not accounted for Japanese genius. For months, Japanese engineers had worked in secret on an impossible problem. They created this, the Type 91 Revision 2 torpedo. It was a masterpiece of death. They attached small, wooden fins, wooden, to the tail. A simple $10 stupid trick. These fins would break off on impact with the water, but not before they stabilized the torpedo's angle. They added a second, gyroscopic control system. The result? A torpedo that could arm and run in just 33 feet of water. A weapon built specifically to kill the ships in Pearl Harbor. The experts in Washington and London were focused on the Philippines, on Malaya. The experts on Battleship Row were preparing for a lazy Sunday. The experts had declared the harbor safe, and at 6 a.m. on December 7th, the Kido Butai turned into the wind. 353 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighters lifted off the decks. The first wave. 183 planes pointed their noses toward the impossible target. At the exact same moment those planes were taking off, Dory Miller was waking up. His day started at 6 a.m. His first duty: serve breakfast in the officers' mess. To understand what Dory Miller did, you must first understand what he was not allowed to do. You must understand the U.S. Navy of 1941. It was a white man's navy, and it had a massive, systemic, and brutal problem. Dory Miller was born in Waco, Texas, in 1919, the son of a sharecropper. He was 6'3", 200 pounds, a powerful, natural athlete. He was the star fullback on his high school football team. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1939 to see the world, to find a better life. But for a black man in 1939, there was only one life. In the 1,942nd U.S. Navy, black sailors were not sailors. They were not allowed to be, by official written policy. They were restricted to one rating: mess attendant or steward's mate. Their official duties: to cook the food, to wash the dishes, to serve the white officers their meals, to clean their quarters, to polish their shoes, to make their beds. They were, in effect, floating valets. They were forbidden, by law, from combat roles. They were forbidden from training on weapons. They were forbidden from becoming gunners, or mechanics, or navigators. Let me be absolutely clear. The expert consensus of the U.S. Navy, the admirals, the architects, was that men like Dory Miller were incapable of combat, that they didn't have the intelligence, the courage, the aptitude. They were not trusted to hold a weapon. They were, literally, the guys who made breakfast. And the men on the USS West Virginia? They knew Dory Miller. They didn't just know him as the quiet man who served their coffee. They knew him as the ship's heavyweight boxing champion. In the brutal, bare-knuckle smokers held on the deck, Miller had defeated every man who challenged him. He was a warrior, forced to be a valet. He was a gun, wrapped in an apron, a man with the heart of a lion, who was only allowed to collect laundry. This was the man who was about to collide with Yamamoto's grand, impossible plan. 7:48 a.m. Dory Miller is below decks. Some reports say he was in the laundry, others in the galley. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he is deep inside the ship, 4 decks down, surrounded by steel, near the waterline. He is, by every definition, in a trap. On the bridge, high above him, the officer of the deck, a young ensign, sees something. A plane. Strange. It's not one of theirs. He looks closer. He sees the red circle on the wing. The meatball. He screams for the general alarm. It is too late. The first wave of torpedo bombers is already here. They are not high-level bombers. They are coming in low, fast, suicidally close. The Japanese pilots, the best in the world, can see the faces of the sailors on the decks. They are aiming. specifically for the battleships. Aboard the USS West Virginia, the first klaxons blare. Sailors are running, confused. Some are still in their pajamas. There is no time. There is no time. Dory Miller hears the alarm. He starts moving toward his battle station, the ammunition magazine, deep in the ship's belly. 7:51 a.m. The first Type 91 torpedo, the one with the wooden fins, slams into the West Virginia's port side. The explosion is catastrophic. It tears a 20-foot hole in the hull. Instantly, thousands of tons of harbor water, black with oil and filth, begin to flood the lower decks. Before the ship can even react, a second torpedo hits, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. The sixth torpedo hits. This one is different. It slams into the ship's rudder. It disables the steering. It is a killing blow. In less than 2 minutes, the USS West Virginia has been hit by at least 7 torpedoes. It is a death sentence. Down below, where Dory Miller is, it is pure, black, screaming hell. The force of the explosions throws him against a bulkhead. The lights are gone. There is only darkness. And the sound of an entire ocean rushing in. The ship, his ship, begins to lurch. It is capsizing. It is dying. All around him, men are trapped, drowning in the dark. The ammunition magazine he was running to, it's already underwater. His official battle station is gone. He is in a flooded, lightless steel tomb that is rapidly rolling over. The experts are dead. The system is in flames. The forbidden cook is on his own. Dory Miller is a cook. He is not a damage control specialist, but he is also a survivor. He fights his way, in the pitch black, against the surge of water, against the tilt of the ship. He knows these passageways better than anyone. He cleans them. He moves by touch and by memory. Up. He has to go up. He breaks out onto the main deck and into a nightmare. The sky is black, not with clouds, but with planes. The air is not air. It is a screaming 2,000-degree inferno of smoke, cordite, and aviation fuel. Men are on fire. Men are jumping from the decks. The water itself is on fire. The USS Arizona, moored just behind them, has just exploded. A 1 million-pound bomb has detonated its forward magazine. The explosion, a fireball 500 feet high, lifts the 33,000-ton Arizona out of the water. The shockwave hits the West Virginia like the fist of God. It knocks Dory Miller flat. He looks around. Chaos. The ship's anti-aircraft guns are silent. Why? Why is no one shooting back? The Japanese planes are not just dropping torpedoes. They are now strafing the decks. Their 7.7 millimeters machine guns are tearing the crew, the experts, to pieces. The trained gunners, the men who were allowed to use the weapons, are dead. They are slumped over their 50 caliber mounts, their bodies shredded. The untrained men, the cooks, the musicians, the officers, are running for cover. The sound is not a pop, pop, pop. It is a deafening, bone-shattering roar. A 50 caliber round is a monster. It is the size of a man's thumb. It exits the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It is designed to rip aircraft engines out of the sky. And Dory Miller, the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, is holding 2 of them. He doesn't know about leading a target. He doesn't know about ballistic drop. He knows instinct. He knows how to point. And he points it at the sky. At the swarms of Japanese planes, the dive bombers of the second wave, now screaming down to finish what the torpedoes started. He points the barrel and he unleashes hell. He doesn't fire in short, controlled bursts like the experts would tell you to. He holds the triggers down. He creates a wall of fire. A 1,600 round per minute stream of tracers, incendiaries, and armor-piercing slugs. He is not aiming. He is erasing. He is drawing a line of steel in the sky and telling the Japanese planes, "You cannot pass." The other officers, the men on the bridge, they look down, and they cannot believe what they are seeing. It is the cook, the mess attendant, the man who was forbidden from combat, who is now fighting the most effective, the only, anti-aircraft defense on the entire dying battleship. The Japanese pilots see it too. They are used to silent, undefended targets. They are not used to a single, furious, non-stop volcano of 50 caliber fire erupting from the deck of a ship that should already be at the bottom of the sea. They begin to avoid his firing arc. His gun, the cook's gun, has become the single most dangerous piece of real estate on Battleship Row. He fires, and he fires, and he fires, for 15 minutes, 15 straight minutes, under constant strafing, as bombs explode around him, as his ship lists, sinking beneath his feet. He does not flinch. He does not stop. He does not run for cover. He just fires. He keeps firing until the ammunition belts run dry. He keeps firing until the water lapping at the deck is so high it threatens to swamp his position. He keeps firing until the last plane in the sky is gone. He keeps firing until the only sound left is the hiss of fire and the groans of his dying ship. Then, silence. The attack is over. The sky is empty. Dory Miller lets go of the handles. His arms are numb. His ears are ringing. He is covered in sweat, oil, and cordite. He looks around. The battle is over. But the West Virginia's fight for life has just been lost. The ship is finished. It has taken, in total, 7 torpedoes, more than any other ship that day. It has taken 2 massive armor-piercing bombs. The port side of the ship is a mangled, flooded wreck. The ship is listing 28 degrees. It is sinking. Fast. The abandoned ship order is finally given. The West Virginia, this 33,000-ton fortress, is not a ship anymore. It is a tomb. It is settling, rapidly, into the 40-foot-deep mud of the harbor. It is not capsizing, like the USS Oklahoma, only because the USS Tennessee is moored inboard, holding it partially upright. Dory Miller, his forbidden act complete, is now just a sailor again. He helps his shipmates. He pulls wounded men from the wreckage. He directs men, dazed and bleeding, toward the lines being thrown from the Tennessee. He helps stretch a plank between the 2 massive ships. He and the other survivors walk from their sinking battleship onto the deck of the Tennessee. He is one of the last men to leave. He looks back. His home, the ship where he had boxed and cooked and collected laundry, is gone. It is a burning, smoking, half-submerged hulk. The water around it is a lake of fire. And inside it, still trapped in the flooded lower decks, are 106 of his shipmates, 106 men who would never see the sun again, including the man he tried to save, Captain Mervyn Bennion, who bled to death at his post on the bridge. The ship is sinking. The crew is being slaughtered. The experts have failed. The system has collapsed. And in this moment, Dory Miller sees a problem. Not the planes, not the sinking ship. He sees the captain, Captain Mervyn Bennion. He is lying on the bridge, his body mangled. A piece of shrapnel from the Arizona's explosion. He has ripped open his stomach. He is dying. And he is still trying to command his ship. He refuses to leave. The ship's executive officer, A man named Johnson runs to Miller. He doesn't see a cook. He just sees a 200-pound man. A strong man. "Help me move the captain," he screams. The bridge is exposed. The air is thick with bullets. This is suicide. Dory Miller does not hesitate. He and Officer Johnson run into the fire. They grab their dying captain. Benyon is in agony, but he is still conscious. "Leave me," he orders. "I'm done for." Miller ignores him. He is the ship's heavyweight champion. He gently lifts the captain, a man he had probably served coffee to just that morning, and he carries him. He carries him out of the fire to a place of relative safety. He has done his duty. He has saved his captain from the flames. He could have stopped. No one, and no one, would have blamed him. He could have found a life raft. He could have jumped overboard. He was, after all, just a cook. But Dory Miller is not done. He has saved his captain. But the planes are still coming. They are still strafing, still killing his shipmates. And the guns are still silent. He looks at the burning sky. He looks at the dead gunners. And he looks at the guns. 2 50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine guns, mounted on the deck, silent, waiting, a weapon he has been forbidden to touch, a machine he has never been trained to fire, a role his experts told him he was unfit to perform. He looks at the gun. He runs. He runs past the dead gunners. He leaps over the twisted steel, and he gets behind the twin-mounted 50 caliber Browning machine guns, a weapon system weighing over 130 pounds. A complex, belt-fed, air-cooled machine designed to fire 800 rounds per minute. A weapon, we must remember, he had never been trained on. He is not a gunner. He has no idea how to load it. He has no idea how to aim it. He just knows it needs to fire. A young officer, Ensign Fred White, is nearby. He sees Miller. He doesn't see a cook. He sees a strong pair of hands. "Can you fire that thing?" White yells over the roar. Miller is honest. "No, sir, but I can learn," White yells back. "I'll load it. You fire it." This is the moment the expert system breaks. The rules are gone. The policy is in flames. There are no more cooks and gunners. There are only the living and the dead. White and another sailor, they manage to get the ammunition belts feeding into the guns. Miller grips the spade handles. He pulls the trigger. And for the first time, the USS West Virginia fires back. The attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's impossible gamble, is over. In just 90 minutes, the Japanese have won. It is the greatest, most devastating naval victory in modern history. 2,403 Americans are dead. 1,178 are wounded. 18 ships, including all 7 battleships on Battleship Row, are sunk or crippled. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, the sleeping giant, has been decapitated in its bed. The experts in Washington are in shock. The experts at Pearl Harbor are in ruins. The system, the plan, the expert consensus that declared Pearl Harbor safe has failed completely. And in the middle of this catastrophic failure, in the middle of this national nightmare, a new problem is brewing. A story, a legend, the story of the cook who manned a gun. In the chaotic days after the attack, as the smoke clears, as the Navy tries to understand what just happened, reports begin to flood in. Survivors of the West Virginia, the officers, the sailors, are all telling the same impossible story. The story of Dory Miller. They talk about how he saved the captain. They talk about how he, a mess attendant, with no training, fired a 50 caliber machine gun. And they talk about the planes, the Japanese planes that he shot down. How many? The reports are frantic. Some say they saw him hit 2. Others swear it was 4. Some claimed it was as many as 6. We will never know the exact number. The chaos of that morning, the smoke, the fire, the 1,600 rounds per minute, made it impossible to confirm. But the U.S. Navy, in its official after-action report, would later state, in black and white, that Dory Miller fired the gun with marked efficiency and is credited with shooting down at least 2, and possibly as many as 6, enemy aircraft. Let's be clear. Even one plane is a miracle. Trained gunners, on a good day, with a stable platform, would be lucky to hit one. A cook on a sinking ship, under constant fire. Hitting any is not just improbable, it is impossible. And now, the United States Navy, the same organization that told Miller he was only fit to serve coffee, had a massive political and public relations problem. What do you do with a hero who was never supposed to be one? What do you do when your greatest hero, from your greatest defeat, is the one man your entire system was designed to ignore? The Navy, the experts, the admirals, faced a choice. This was a war for hearts and minds. America was broken, defeated, humiliated. The public was desperate for a hero, for one good story from a day of total disaster. And the Navy had one. The problem? He was black. In a segregated, racist America at war. The story of Dory Miller was not a story. It was a bomb. The expert consensus of 1,941, the political, the military, was that you could not, you must not, tell the American public that a black man, a cook, was the hero of Pearl Harbor. It would shatter the system. It would upend the social order. It would, they argued, destroy the morale of the white troops. And so the experts made a decision. The same experts who declared Pearl Harbor safe. They decided to bury the story. They decided to make Dory Miller disappear. The first. Initial reports praised an unnamed sailor, a Negro messman, whose bravery was noted, but whose identity was kept a secret. For months, the Navy refused to name him. They praised the heroes. They listed the dead. But Dory Miller, the man who actually fought back, was erased. He was a forbidden hero. His act was too insane, too impossible for the experts to handle. They thought they could control the narrative. They thought they could just move on. They had not accounted for the power of the truth. And they certainly had not accounted for the black press. An organization called the Pittsburgh Courier, a newspaper for the black community, got wind of the story. An unnamed Negro hero? They sent a reporter, a man named Frank Bolden, and he began to dig. He began to ask the one question the Navy did not want to answer. What is his name? No, no, no. The Navy's expert system had survived the Japanese torpedoes, but it was about to collide with an impossible force it could not defeat. A high school dropout who had become a legend, and a press that was about to unleash a storm. The Pittsburgh Courier was not just a newspaper. It was a weapon, and it was pointed directly at the U.S. Navy's expert consensus. The Navy stonewalled. They refused to comment. They classified the reports. They hoped the story would die. But the Courier, led by its executive editor, Percival L. Pratis, would not let it go. They were joined by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP's executive secretary, Walter White, a man who could pass for white and had used it to investigate lynchings in the South, now turned his full investigative power on the U.S. Navy. The pressure built from the press, from civil rights leaders, from senators. The story of the unnamed Negro hero was becoming a national embarrassment. The experts in Washington had a war to fight. They did not have time for a social problem, but the story was now too big to bury. The Navy's expert system, built on a century of prejudice, could not hold. It had survived the Japanese torpedoes. It could not survive the truth. On March 14th, 1942, 3 months after the attack, the Navy finally surrendered. They released the name, Dory Miller, Mess Attendant, 3rd Class. The story exploded. In the black community, Dory Miller became a legend, a folk hero. He was a real-life John Henry, a man of impossible strength who had fought the machine. He was the man who proved that they were not just fit to serve, they were fit to fight. The Navy, now facing a public relations tidal wave, had to make a second, even more impossible decision. The experts in Washington, the politicians, had failed. So, the experts in the field took over. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, the man who had replaced the failed command. Nimitz was not a politician. He was a warrior. And he knew a hero when he saw one. On May 27th, 1942, the location, the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. The context, this was not just a ceremony. The Enterprise was just days away from sailing into the most critical naval battle in history, the Battle of Midway. The ship was a hornet's nest of activity. Pilots were being briefed. Engines were being tuned. The war, the real war, was hanging on a thread. And in the middle of this high-stakes, pre-battle tension, Admiral Nimitz paused the war. He held a ceremony, and he called forward Mess Attendant Dory Miller. The press was invited. The cameras were rolling. This was the Navy's expert surrender. Nimitz, the most powerful admiral in the Pacific, stood in front of the two-year-old cook, and he personally pinned the Navy Cross on Miller's chest. Let's be absolutely clear about what the Navy Cross is. It is the second highest decoration for valor in the United States Navy, second only to the Medal of Honor. It is given for extraordinary heroism in combat, and on that day, it was the first Navy Cross awarded for heroism in World War II. Awarded. To a cook. Awarded. To a black man. By the Commander-in-Chief himself. The citation read, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety." In one moment, Admiral Nimitz, a man who understood the system, had shattered it. He had officially and publicly declared that the Forbidden Act was an act of extraordinary heroism. But the story does not end there. Dory Miller was now the most famous black man in America. He was a superstar. The experts in Washington, the ones who had tried to bury him, now saw his value. He was pulled from sea duty. He was sent home to America, and he was sent on a war bond tour. This was the Navy's expert consensus in action again. They had a problem. Black American morale was at an all-time low. Why, they asked, should we fight for a country that treats us as second-class citizens? Why should we buy bonds for a Navy that will only let us be valets? The experts needed a symbol, and Dory Miller was the perfect symbol. He was put on posters. He was paraded through cities. New York, Chicago, his home in Waco, Texas. He gave speeches, encouraging black Americans to buy war bonds, to enlist in a Navy that would still only let them be cooks. This was the tragic irony. Dory Miller was a national hero who held the Navy Cross, and he was still a mess attendant. The experts had given him a medal, but they had not changed his job description. He was a hero in a cage. He was a warrior, forced, once again, to be a symbol. But his forbidden act had done something the experts could never take back. Because of the Dory Miller effect, because of the massive public pressure he had created, the Navy, in that same year, 1942, finally, opened up other ratings. For the first time, black sailors were allowed to train as gunners, as mechanics, as radiomen. Dory Miller, the cook, had not just fired a gun. He had fired the bullet that began the end of segregation in the U.S. Navy. That was his true, impossible legacy. Miller hated the war bond tour. He was not a politician. He was not a symbol. He was a sailor. He was a warrior. And his friends, his shipmates, were still out there, fighting. He requested, he demanded, to be sent back to sea, to return to the war. In 1943, the experts finally agreed. His value as a symbol was fading. The war needed fighters. He was assigned to a new ship. This was not a mighty battleship. This was a baby flat top, an escort carrier called the USS Liscum Bay. These ships were the workhorses of the Pacific. They were small, fast, and, as it turned out, critically vulnerable. They were built on merchant ship hulls. They were not armored like a battleship. They were, in effect, floating fuel tanks carrying bombs. Dory Miller was, by now, a celebrity among the new crew. He had been promoted. He was now cook, third class. His battle station was in the magazine. He was, once again, the man passing ammunition to the gunners, the job he had been trying to get to at Pearl Harbor. In November 1943, the Liscum Bay was in the Gilbert Islands, supporting the brutal, bloody invasion of Tarawa. This was Operation Galvanic. The Liscum Bay's job was to provide air cover for the Marines dying on the beaches. It was a high-stakes, high-danger mission. The ship was part of a task group, surrounded by destroyers. The expert consensus was that they were safe, protected, but the experts had, once again, failed to account for the enemy. 4:30 a.m., November 24th, 1943, Thanksgiving Day. It is pitch black. The sea is calm. A single Japanese submarine, the I-175, is hunting. The I-175 is a state-of-the-art fleet submarine. Its commander, Tadashi Inada, is an experienced, patient killer. For hours, he has been stalking the American task force. He penetrates the destroyer's screen. An impossible feat. He is now inside the protective ring of warships. He raises his periscope, and he sees a perfect target. The silhouette of an aircraft carrier against the pre-dawn light. The USS Liscum Bay. Commander Inada does not fire one torpedo. He fires a spread. 4 Type 95 torpedoes. The deadly oxygen-fueled Long Lance variants leap from their tubes and race toward the carrier. They are silent. They are wakeless. Aboard the Liscum Bay, the klaxon for general quarters has just sounded. Not because of the torpedoes, but because it's 5:05 a.m., time for the dawn patrol. Planes are being armed on the flight deck. Bombs are being moved. Fuel lines are running. The ship is, in this exact moment, a 10,000-ton bomb. Dory Miller is at his post, deep inside the ship, in the magazine, surrounded by explosives. 5:13 a.m. A lookout on the battleship USS New Mexico sees a flicker, a shadow in the water. He screams, "Torpedo wake!" But it's not for his ship. It's for the Liscum Bay. A single torpedo, one of the 4, slams into the Liscum Bay's starboard side, just behind the engine room. It hits the one place that guarantees death. The aircraft bomb magazine. The exact place where Dory Miller is stationed. The impossible happened again. The Liscum Bay did not sink. It evaporated. The ship did not have time to burn. The entire 10,000-ton vessel detonated in a single, catastrophic, blinding fireball. A column of fire, smoke, and steel shot 1,000 feet into the air. The explosion was so violent that men on ships miles away were knocked off their feet. It rained debris and men down on the decks of the USS New Mexico, a battleship 5,000 yards away. The ship's own task force commander, Admiral Slew McCain, was rocked so hard he thought his ship had been hit. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing, just a hole in the ocean. The Liscum Bay was gone. It had been blown into a million pieces. It took 23 minutes for the last burning fragment of the stern to disappear beneath the waves. 644 sailors gone in an instant, including the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, the hero of Pearl Harbor, the man who was only fit to serve coffee. Dory Miller was killed in action. His body was never found. After the war, the experts, the admirals, the historians, had to write the story of the U.S. Navy, and they could no longer erase the cook. His Forbidden Act was now a permanent part of history. In 1973, the United States Navy commissioned a new warship, a 4,100-ton frigate. They could have named it after any admiral, any expert. Instead, they named it the USS Miller, a ship of war, named for the man who was once forbidden from even touching a gun, and the expert consensus finally, completely broke. In 2001, the Navy commissioned the USS Dory Miller, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship. In 2020, the Navy announced the ultimate impossible act. The next Gerald R. Ford class, the most powerful, most advanced, most expensive ship in human history. A $1.3 billion nuclear-powered supercarrier will be named the USS Dory Miller, the first supercarrier in history to be named for an enlisted sailor, the first to be named for a Black American. Thomas Lawson, the cook from our last story, had an insane idea that solved an impossible engineering problem. He saved 4,200 men. Dory Miller had a forbidden act. He did not solve an engineering problem. He solved a human one. He proved to a nation and to the world that the expert consensus was wrong. He proved that courage does not care about your rank. It does not care about your training, and it certainly does not care about the color of your skin. Sometimes the difference between defeat and victory is not a new technology. It's one person noticing what the experts missed and having the courage to do the one thing that everyone else said was forbidden. This isn't just a story from World War II. It's a story about challenging the system. Let us know in the comments, what was Dory Miller's most impossible act? Manning the gun? Or breaking the system that tried to stop him? Your opinions are critical to this channel. If you enjoyed this piece of hidden history, do us a favor and hit that like button. And for more forbidden stories that the experts tried to bury, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss an upload. In our next video, we will uncover the ghost army that fooled Hitler in broad daylight. On the morning of December 18, 1944, the Second World War stopped making sense. The experts said Nazi Germany was dead. The maps said the war was over. But standing on a frozen bridge in Belgium, a 19-year-old American boy was staring directly at a monster that wasn't supposed to exist. He was facing a German King Tiger tank. a 70-ton fortress of steel that could vaporize a house from 2 miles away. Its armor was so thick that Allied shells shattered against it like glass. It was the apex predator of the 20th century. Standing against it was Francis Curry. He wasn't a commando. He wasn't a ranger. He was a 130-pound orphan from Indiana who had never been in a fistfight in his life. He had no air support. He had no tank support. All he had was a frozen ditch, a bazooka, and a manual that said he was already dead. But Francis Curry was a farm boy. And on the farm, you don't read the manual when the wolf is at the door. You just pick up the shovel. In the next 10 minutes, this skinny teenager wouldn't just break the laws of physics, he would rewrite the history of the Battle of the Bulge. He would do things that action movies are afraid to show because audiences wouldn't believe it was real. This is the story of how one orphan, alone in the snow, decided to fight the entire German army, and won. To understand the sheer insanity of this moment, you have to look at the trap he walked into. The Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The American soldiers called it the Ghost Front. It was a quiet sector, a place where battered units were sent to rest and where new, green units were sent to learn the ropes. The war here felt distant. The deep pine forests were silent. The snow was pristine, but the silence was a lie. While the American soldiers wrote letters home about Christmas, hiding in the mist just a few miles away, Adolf Hitler was assembling the greatest secret army the world had ever seen. Hitler knew he was losing, but he had one final desperate gamble. A plan so audacious that his own generals told him it was suicide. He stripped the Eastern Front. He pulled boys from high schools and old men from factories. He gathered the last elite remnants of the SS Panzer divisions. Over 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, all moving at night, all under total radio silence. The experts in Allied intelligence said this was impossible. They said the Ardennes was impassable for tanks in winter. They relied on aerial reconnaissance. But the weather had turned. A thick, heavy fog, the Hitler weather, descended on the forest. It grounded the Allied Air Force. It blinded the spy planes. Under that blanket of white fog, the monsters were creeping forward. Francis Curry and his unit, Company K of the 120th Infantry, arrived in the town of Malmedy on December 17th. They were told to secure a bridge. It was supposed to be a routine guard duty. They didn't know that they were standing directly in the path of the spearhead. The temperature dropped to 0. The ground froze so hard that digging a foxhole required dynamite. The men shivered in their thin coats, their boots soaking through. Francis Curry, the young sergeant, checked his men. He was quiet. He was always quiet. Most 19-year-olds in the army were loud. They bragged about girls, about cars, about what they'd do to the Germans. Francis didn't brag. He just watched. He watched the tree line. He watched the fog. He had a feeling. It was the same feeling a farmer gets when the birds suddenly stop singing. The feeling that the storm isn't coming. It's already here. Who was this boy standing on the edge of the apocalypse? Francis Curry was born in 1925 in New York, but his story really began when he lost everything. By the time he was 12, he was an orphan. He didn't have the luxury of a childhood. He was bounced around, foster homes, uncles, finally landing on a farm in Indiana. In the 1930s, an orphan on a farm wasn't a family member. He was a hand. He worked from sunrise to sunset, pitching hay, fixing fences, driving tractors. It was a brutal life. It taught him silence. It taught him that complaining didn't fix the tractor. Crying didn't feed the cows. If something was broken, you fixed it with what you had. If a job was too heavy, You found a lever. You found a way. This wasn't military training. This was orphan grit. While other kids were playing sports, learning teamwork and rules, Francis was learning self-reliance. He learned that in the real world, nobody is coming to save you. When the war broke out, Francis tried to join the fight. He walked into the recruitment office at 17. The recruiter looked at him and laughed. He told him, "Son, you're too small. The rifle weighs more than you do." He was rejected, but Francis didn't know how to quit. He went back when he turned 18. He ate bananas and drank gallons of water just to make the minimum weight requirement. He barely passed. The army looked at him and saw a weakling. They saw a kid who should be a clerk or a cook. They didn't see his hands. Hands that were calloused from gripping frozen plow handles. They didn't see his eyes. Eyes that were used to scanning the horizon for trouble. He was assigned to the infantry. And by July 1944, he was in Europe. He wasn't the popular guy in the platoon. He wasn't the hero type. He was the one you forgot was there. Until the shooting started. In the months leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, his unit noticed something strange about the skinny kid from Indiana. When the mortars fell, he didn't panic. When the orders got confused, he didn't freeze. He just worked. He treated combat like a broken tractor. It was a problem to be solved. He became an expert with the bar, the Browning automatic rifle. A heavy, powerful weapon that usually required a big man to handle. Francis lugged it around like it was a toy. He mastered the bazooka, a weapon most soldiers hated because it was dangerous and unreliable. Francis tinkered with it. He learned its quirks. By December 1944, the weakling was a sergeant, a squad leader. But nothing in his life, not the farm, not the training, could prepare him for what was about to come out of that fog. December 16, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The silence of the Ghost Front was shattered by the roar of 1,600 German artillery guns firing at once. The ground shook for miles. Trees exploded into splinters. The American front line didn't just break, it evaporated. The German offensive was a tidal wave. Confusion reigned. American units were cut off. Generals lost contact with their regiments. Panic began to spread like a virus. The roads were clogged with retreating vehicles, jeeps, trucks, ambulances, all fleeing west, away from the monsters emerging from the smoke. But at Malmedy, Francis Curry's unit was told to hold. They were guarding a bridge over the Warch River, a vital choke point. If the Germans crossed this bridge, they could flank the entire American defense. Curry and his squad dug in. They watched the refugees streaming past them. They heard the rumors. The SS is coming. They're killing prisoners. They have the King Tigers. This wasn't just rumor. Just a few miles away, at a crossroads, an SS unit captured over 80 American prisoners. They marched them into a field. And then they machine-gunned them all, the Malmedy massacre. The message was clear. The Germans weren't taking prisoners. This was a war of extermination. By the morning of December 18th, Francis Curry's platoon was effectively alone. The strong point they were holding was a paper house. They had a few rifles, a machine gun, and a pile of anti-tank mines that were frozen into the mud. Francis looked at his position. He looked at the factory building near the bridge where they had set up their command post. It was a trap. If the tanks came, they would be boxed in. The doctrine was clear. If you are overrun by superior armor, you fall back to a secondary defensive line. You preserve your force. But Francis Curry wasn't thinking about doctrine. He was looking at the layout of the town. He was looking at the houses, the hedgerows, the ditches. His farmer's eye was calculating angles. He wasn't planning a retreat. He was planning a hunt. The sound came first. It wasn't an engine. It was a vibration in the chest. The ice on the trees began to shake, dusting the snow onto the soldiers' helmets. Then, the squeal of metal on metal, the terrifying clanking of tracks that hadn't been greased. Francis Curry was in a foxhole near the bridge. He raised his head slowly. Through the morning mist, 200 yards away, a shape materialized. It was huge. It was painted in winter camouflage, white and gray jagged lines. The long barrel of the 88mm cannon looked like a telephone pole. It was a tank, but not just any tank. It was the lead tank of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own bodyguard regiment. These were the most fanatical, battle-hardened killers in the German military. And they weren't alone. Behind the tank, moving like shadows in the snow, were German infantrymen. Dozens of them. Francis looked to his left. He looked to his right. His squad was outnumbered 10-1. They were outgunned 100-1. The tank stopped. Its turret began to rotate slowly, mechanical, cold. It was searching for a target. The barrel lowered. It pointed directly at the building where Francis's friends were hiding. Francis Curry realized in that split second that nobody was coming to save them. The air support was grounded. The artillery was gone. The cavalry wasn't coming over the hill. He looked at the bazooka lying in the snow next to him. He looked at the tank. The farmer from Indiana took a breath. He grabbed the bazooka, and he stood up. The rocket left the tube with a scream that tore through the frozen air. Francis Curry didn't wait to see it hit. He dropped into the snow instantly, curling his body into the frozen mud. A split second later, there was a metallic clang that sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a church bell. The bazooka round slammed into the King Tiger's turret ring. It didn't penetrate. It didn't explode the tank in a ball of fire, like in the movies. It just shattered. But it did something more important. It blinded them. The explosion stripped away the tank's external optics. Inside that steel beast, the German crew suddenly went blind. They panicked. The turret jerked left, then right. The massive 88mm cannon roared, firing a shell blindly into the factory wall above Curry's head. The concussion wave hit him like a physical punch, knocking the air out of his lungs and burying him in a shower of brick dust and snow. Francis Curry lay there, gasping, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Most men would have stayed down. Most men would have curled into a ball and prayed for the end. Francis Curry checked his bazooka. He had no more rockets. This is the moment where the battle should have ended. A lone infantryman, out of ammo, pinned down by a blind but furious tank, with SS stormtroopers moving up to flank him. But this is where the farm boy logic took over. On the farm, when the tractor runs out of gas, you don't sit there and stare at it. You walk to the barn and you get more gas. Francis looked across the road. Through the smoke and the flying debris, he saw a half-track. It was an American vehicle, abandoned earlier that morning in the initial retreat. It was sitting about 50 yards away, near the entrance of the factory where 5 of his squad mates were trapped. And sitting in the back of that vehicle, uncovered and freezing in the snow, was a crate. A wooden crate marked with the yellow stencil of ordnance. Rockets. Between Francis and that crate was 50 yards of open ground. This wasn't just open ground. It was a kill zone. The German machine gunners had set up a crossfire. The air was thick with tracers, buzzing like angry hornets. The snow was kicking up in little spurts where the bullets were hitting. Francis didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for cover fire. He just ran. He moved with the awkward, loping speed of a kid who had spent his life chasing stray cattle. Bullets zipped past his ear, close enough to burn. He dove behind the half-track, sliding on the ice, crashing into the metal treads with a thud that bruised his ribs. He scrambled up the side of the vehicle. He grabbed the rocket crate. His fingers were numb, clumsy from the cold. He ripped the wood open, splintering it. He grabbed a rocket. He loaded the bazooka. But as he turned back to the street, the situation had changed. The King Tiger, blinded and cautious, had pulled back behind a farmhouse. But in its place, 3 German Panzer tanks came rolling around the corner. These weren't the heavy Tigers. These were Panzer IVs. They were faster, more agile, and they were supporting infantry. The German soldiers were moving house to house, clearing the town. They were methodical. They were the best trained soldiers in the world, and they knew, based on the volume of fire coming from the factory, that there must be a whole platoon of Americans in there. They didn't know it was just one skinny kid with a reloading problem. Francis popped up from behind the half-track. He aimed at the lead Panzer. The bazooka was heavy, awkward, and notorious for misfiring in the cold. The batteries that ignited the rocket propellant would often freeze. Francis had to tap the side of the weapon, praying the circuit would close. He squeezed the trigger. Whoosh! The rocket spiraled out. It hit the lead Panzer directly in the tracks. The explosion blew the heavy steel links apart. The tank slewed violently to the right, its momentum spinning it into a ditch. It was immobilized. A sitting duck. The other 2 tanks stopped. They were confused. Where was the fire coming from? Was it an anti-tank gun? Was it a hidden tank destroyer? They couldn't see Francis. He was too small. He was too low. He was hidden in the debris of the war. But Francis wasn't done. He realized the bazooka wasn't enough to stop the infantry. The German soldiers were closing in on the factory. If they reached the door, they would toss in grenades, and his friends inside, men he had eaten with, slept next to, laughed with, would be turned into meat. Francis needed a machine gun. He looked around his shopping mall of abandoned equipment. He saw a dead American soldier lying near a jeep. Next to him was a bar, the Browning automatic rifle. Francis dropped the bazooka. He ran, again, through the machine gun fire. He slid into the snow next to the fallen soldier. He grabbed the bar. He checked the magazine. Full. He rolled onto his stomach, rested the heavy bipod on a frozen rock, and opened fire. The bar is a terrifying weapon. It fires a .30-06 round, the same heavy bullet used by snipers at 600 rounds per minute. It creates a wall of noise and lead. Francis swept the German line. He wasn't just spraying and praying. He was shooting like a farmer protecting his coop from wolves. Controlled bursts, short, accurate. 3 German soldiers who were rushing the factory door dropped. The others dove for cover behind a stone wall. They yelled orders to each other, screaming for a medic, screaming for suppressing fire. For the next 10 minutes, Francis Curry became a one-man army. He would fire the bar until it clicked empty. Then he would roll to a new position, grab the bazooka, fire a rocket at a tank, drop the bazooka, reload the bar, and fire again. To the Germans, this was baffling. It looked like they were facing a coordinated defense. They saw rockets coming from the left, machine gun fire coming from the right. They assumed they were fighting 10 men. They never imagined that one boy was frantically sprinting back and forth, switching weapons like a juggler, sweating through his uniform in sub-zero temperatures. But the physical toll was mounting. Every time Francis fired the bazooka, the backblast kicked up snow and revealed his position. Every time he ran, he was slower. His lungs were burning from the cold air. His hands were bleeding from the sharp metal of the ammo crates, and the Germans were adapting. They pinpointed his position near the half-track. A German officer shouted a command. A turret on one of the remaining tanks turned. Boom! A high-explosive shell slammed into the ground 10 feet from Francis. The blast lifted him off the ground and threw him backward like a rag doll. He hit the wall of the factory hard. His ears were bleeding. His vision was blurry. Shrapnel had torn through his coat. He lay there in the snow, staring up at the gray sky. The pain was distant, dull. The cold was creeping in. This is the moment where the human body is supposed to give up. The adrenaline crash, the shock, the biological impulse to stay down and play dead. But Francis Curry's mind didn't go to death. It went to the work. He realized that if he stayed down, the tank would fire again, and the next one wouldn't miss. Francis rolled over. He spat blood into the snow. He checked his hands. They still worked. He checked his legs. They still worked. He stood up. The German infantry saw him rise. They must have thought he was a ghost. They had just hit him with a tank shell. Why wouldn't he die? Francis saw them preparing to rush him. He reached into his satchel. He had one card left to play. Anti-tank grenades. These weren't normal hand grenades. These were heavy rifle-fired grenades that he had modified to throw by hand. They were dangerous, unstable. If you held them too long, they would blow your arm off. If you threw them too short, they would kill you. Francis pulled the pin on one. He waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. He stood up in full view of the enemy. He hurled the grenade with the arm of a kid who had spent 10 years throwing rocks at crows. The grenade sailed over the stone wall where the Germans were hiding. Crack boom. The explosion was massive. Screams erupted from behind the wall. The German advance stalled instantly. They were terrified. They were fighting a maniac who wouldn't stay down, who had an endless supply of weapons, and who threw grenades with pinpoint accuracy. But Francis knew he couldn't hold them forever. He glanced back at the factory. The 5 American soldiers trapped inside were wounded. They couldn't move fast. They needed a distraction. A big one. Francis looked at the remaining half-track. It was still operational. It had a mounted .50 caliber machine gun on the ring mount. He climbed up the side of the vehicle. Bullets pinged off the metal plating around him like hail on a tin roof. He grabbed the handles of the .50 cal. This was the heavy hitter. The Ma Deuce. The weapon that could tear through brick walls and light armored vehicles like they were paper. Francis spun the gun around. He saw a German self-propelled gun, a massive artillery piece on tracks, moving up the road to finish off the factory. Francis unleashed hell. The .50 caliber roared. The recoil shook his entire body. He walked the tracers right into the vision slit of the self-propelled gun. Sparks flew. The vehicle swerved, blindingly backing up, crashing into a house. Then he turned the gun on the infantry. He forced them to keep their heads down. He bought time, precious seconds. He screamed over his shoulder, his voice cracking from the smoke and the cold. "Get out! Now! Move!" The 5 trapped soldiers heard him. They saw the insane cover fire he was laying down. They burst out of the factory door, dragging their wounded comrades, limping towards the woods behind the American lines. Francis watched them go. He kept firing. He was the shield. As long as that gun was firing, the Germans focused on him. He was holding the entire line. One gun. One boy. But then, the gun jammed. Click. Francis pulled the charging handle. Nothing. He pulled it again. The cold had frozen the oil. The gun was dead. Silence fell over the street. A terrifying silence. Francis looked up. The Germans were realizing the gun had stopped. They were standing up. They were raising their rifles. Francis was out of rockets. He was out of grenades. His machine gun was jammed. He was alone in the middle of the street, exposed, wounded, and exhausted. He had 3 seconds before they turned him into Swiss cheese. He dove out of the half-track, hitting the ground rolling. He scrambled towards the factory ruins. Bullets chewed up the snow where his head had been a second ago. He crawled through a hole in the wall, tumbling into the darkness of the ruined building. He lay in the rubble, his chest heaving like a bellows. He checked his ammo belt. He had his M1 Garand rifle and 2 clips of ammunition. 16 bullets. That was it. Outside, he heard the German commander shouting. They were organizing a final assault. They were going to level the building. They were bringing up the flamethrowers. Francis crawled to a window. He wiped the fog from his glasses. He saw them coming. Not tanks this time. Men. A squad of SS pioneers. They were carrying canisters on their backs. Flamethrowers. If they got within range, they would burn the building down with him inside. It was a horrific way to die. Francis should have retreated. He had saved his men. He had done his duty. He could slip out the back and run into the woods. No one would blame him. He would get a medal just for what he had already done. But Francis looked at the bridge he was supposed to protect. If he left, the Germans would take the bridge. If they took the bridge, the tanks would cross. If the tanks crossed, they would hit the fuel depots in the rear. And if they got the fuel, the German war machine would keep rolling for months. Thousands more Americans would die. Francis Curry, the orphan from Loch Sheldrake, realized that the entire war had shrunk down to this one pile of bricks. He wasn't fighting for democracy. He wasn't fighting for the flag. He was fighting because this was his patch of dirt, and he wasn't done farming it yet. He raised his rifle. He aimed at the lead soldier carrying the flamethrower. The tank was a metal monster he couldn't hurt with a rifle. But the flamethrower, that was a walking bomb. Francis took a deep breath. He let it out slowly, watching the steam rise in the freezing air. He needed a perfect shot. If he missed, the man would pull the trigger and Francis would be ash. He squeezed. Crack. The bullet hit the tank of the flamethrower. A ball of orange fire erupted in the street. It was brighter than the sun. The explosion consumed the German squad. The shockwave blew out the remaining windows of the factory. The burning fuel sprayed across the street, creating a wall of fire between Francis and the enemy. The German advance halted again. They couldn't move through the inferno. Francis slumped back against the wall. He was shaking uncontrollably now. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of hypothermia. His hands were blue. He couldn't feel his feet. He looked at his watch. It was only 10 a.m. He had been fighting for hours, but the day wasn't over. And the Germans weren't leaving. From the smoke on the other side of the fire, he heard the sound of heavy engines again. More tanks, reinforcements. Francis checked his last clip of ammo. 8 bullets. He was trapped. He was alone. And the fire outside was starting to die down. The wall of flame that protected him was fading. And through the smoke, he could see the shadows of the SS soldiers forming up again. They were angry now. They were humiliated. And they were coming to finish the job. Francis Curry loaded his last clip. He sat in the darkness, listening to the boots crunching on. The snow getting closer. Closer. He gripped his rifle. He was the last man standing in Malmedy. And the hunt was just beginning. The fire that had saved Francis Curry's life was burning out. The wall of flame that separated him from the 1st SS Panzer Division flickered and died, leaving only drifting black smoke and the smell of gasoline. Through that smoke, the gray shapes of the German infantry materialized again. They were moving differently now. They weren't rushing. They were stalking. They knew the American in the ruins was hurt. They knew he was alone. And they knew he was out of heavy weapons. The cat had finished playing with the mouse. Now, it was time to eat. Francis Curry sat in the rubble, gripping his M1 Garand. His hands were so cold they felt like blocks of wood. He had 8 bullets left. 8 pieces of lead against the most elite fighting force in Europe. He checked the action of his rifle one last time. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He just waited. On the farm, you learn that panic is expensive. Patience is free. He heard the crunch of jackboots on glass. They were inside the building. This was the moment the German commander had been waiting for. He had lost tanks. He had lost half-tracks. He had lost an entire squad to a flamethrower explosion. All because of one stubborn position. He was convinced he was facing a fortified bunker manned by a team of commandos. He signaled his men to spread out, to sweep the ruins room by room. But Francis Curry wasn't in the room they expected. He had crawled. While the smoke was still thick, he had belly-crawled over piles of broken brick and glass, dragging his wounded leg, moving deeper into the structure. He found a gap in the masonry, a small, jagged hole that looked out onto the flank of the approaching Germans. He saw them. 4 men, moving in a diamond formation, submachine guns raised. Francis raised his rifle. He took a breath, holding the freezing air in his lungs to steady his aim. Crack! The lead soldier dropped. The other 3 spun around, firing blindly into the shadows. Concrete dust exploded around Francis's face. He didn't flinch. He cycled the bolt. Crack! A second soldier fell, clutching his leg. Francis rolled away, scrambling into the darkness of the basement stairs just as a grenade bounced into the spot where he had been standing. Boom! The explosion shook the foundation of the house. Dust poured down from the ceiling. Francis coughed, tasting blood and plaster. He was deafened. But he was alive. He was playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek in a building that was falling apart around him. He knew the layout of the factory better than they did. He knew which floors were weak. He knew where the shadows were deepest. For the next 20 minutes, Francis Curry became a ghost. He would pop up from a cellar window, fire 2 shots, and vanish. He would emerge from a collapsed roof, drop a piece of debris to distract them, and then fire. From the opposite side, he had 6 bullets left, then 4. Then 2. The Germans were furious. They were screaming orders, firing at shadows, wasting ammunition on empty hallways. They were terrified. The commando team seemed to be everywhere at once. They didn't realize they were chasing one exhausted teenager who was running on pure adrenaline and spite. But luck only lasts so long. Francis was moving past a blown-out window frame, trying to get a line of sight on the officer. He stepped on a loose piece of slate. Click. The sound was tiny, but in the silence of the stalk, it was a scream. A German sniper, positioned in the tree line across the road, had been watching that window for an hour. He heard the click. He saw the movement. He fired. The bullet didn't hit Francis in the chest. It didn't hit him in the head. It hit the steel rim of his helmet. The impact was like being hit by a baseball bat swung by a giant. It snapped Francis's head back violently. The helmet flew off. Francis was lifted off his feet and slammed into the back wall. He slid down to the floor, his rifle clattering away from his hand. Darkness. For a minute, there was nothing. No war. No cold. Just a high-pitched ringing in his brain. Then, slowly, the world came back. It came back as a throbbing headache that felt like a drill boring into his skull. Francis blinked. His vision was swimming. He tried to move his arms, but they wouldn't respond. His body was in shock. He heard voices, German voices, close. Is tot. He is dead. They were in the room. Francis lay perfectly still. He was buried under a pile of drywall and insulation that had fallen during the grenade blast. Only his boot was visible. He heard the heavy tread of boots walking past him. He heard the rattle of equipment. The Germans were securing the building. They thought they had killed him. They thought the sniper had done the job. The German officer barked a command. Sichern und vorrücken. Secure and advance. They were leaving. They were moving past him to take the bridge. Francis Curry lay in the dust, paralyzed. His mission had failed. He had fought like a demon, but they were going to take the bridge anyway. No, the thought wasn't a scream, it was a whisper. A stubborn, Midwestern whisper. Francis forced his fingers to move. He forced his eyes to focus. He saw his rifle lying 3 feet away. It looked like it was miles away. He waited until the footsteps faded. He waited until the heavy engines of the tanks outside started to rev up again. Then he moved. He dragged himself out of the rubble. He crawled to his rifle. He checked the chamber. Empty. He patted his pockets. 1 clip. His last clip. 8 rounds. He couldn't stop the tanks. He knew that. But he also knew that tanks don't fight without orders. He crawled to the back door of the factory. He fell out into the snow, gasping for air. The cold shock revived him slightly. He looked around. He was behind the enemy line now. He saw the German command vehicle, a half-track parked near the hedgerow. The officer was standing in the hatch, looking through binoculars at the bridge, confident that the way was clear. Francis Curry began to crawl. He crawled through a drainage ditch filled with frozen sludge. The ice water soaked through his uniform, numbing his chest, his stomach. He dragged his rifle through the mud, keeping the action clean. He had to get closer. The M1 Garand was accurate, but his hands were shaking so bad he couldn't hold a sight picture. He crawled 50 yards. 70 yards. He was flanking them. The dead man was coming back to haunt them. He reached the edge of the hedgerow. He was 30 yards from the officer. Francis pulled himself up. He rested the rifle on a frozen tree root. He looked through the aperture sight. The officer's back was to him. Francis didn't shoot the officer. He looked past the officer. He saw the fuel drums strapped to the back of the lead tank. The tanks were low on gas. They carried external drums to extend their range. Francis shifted his aim. He squeezed the trigger. Ping. The bullet punched through the thin metal of the fuel drum. Francis fired again. Same spot. Sparks. Francis fired a 3rd time. Whoosh! The fuel vapors ignited. The back of the lead tank erupted into flames. The crew, thinking they had been hit by an anti-tank shell, bailed out, screaming. The burning fuel spilled onto the engine deck. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the narrow road to the bridge. The German officer spun around, looking for the source of the shot. Francis fired his 4th shot. It hit the radio antenna on the command vehicle, shattering it. Chaos. Absolute chaos. The Germans were convinced they were surrounded. The tank was burning. The radio was dead. The sniper reported killing the American, yet shots were coming from the rear. The German commander panicked. He didn't know it was one concussed boy in a ditch. He thought the American main force had counterattacked. He shouted the order. Rückzug! Retreat! The engines roared in reverse. The infantry, terrified of being cut off, began to fall back. They popped smoke grenades, covering their withdrawal. Francis Curry stayed in the ditch, watching them go. He fired his last 4 rounds into the smoke, just to make sure they kept running. Click, empty. Francis dropped the rifle. His head fell forward onto the frozen dirt. He watched the gray shapes fade into the fog. The bridge was safe, but Francis Curry was dying. The adrenaline that had kept him moving for 6 hours was gone. In its place came the white death. Hypothermia. His body temperature was plummeting. He stopped shivering. A bad sign. His vision began to tunnel. He felt a strange, overwhelming warmth spreading through his chest. It was the final lie the body tells you before you freeze to death. He tried to stand up, but his legs were gone. He tried to crawl, but his arms were lead. He rolled onto his back. The sky was turning dark. Night was falling. He was going to die here, alone, in a ditch in Belgium. He thought about the farm. He thought about the cows. He wondered if anyone had fixed the fence in the north pasture. He closed his eyes. The snow began to cover him, a white blanket. It felt soft. It felt like home. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Francis drifted in the space between sleep and death. Then, a sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Boots. Francis didn't move. Let them come, he thought. Let the Germans finish it. I'm tired. A light shone in his face. A flashlight. Over here. I found a rifle. English. Check the ditch. He might be in the ditch. Francis tried to speak, but his lips were frozen shut. He managed a weak groan. Sarge! Over here! I got a body! Hands grabbed him, rough, frantic hands. They brushed the snow off his face. Jesus Christ, a voice whispered. It's Curry. Is he dead? I don't know. Check his pulse. Warm fingers pressed against his neck. It's weak, but it's there. He's alive. Get the stretcher. Move your asses. It was his squad, the men he had saved. They had refused to leave him behind. They had disobeyed orders to retreat further. They had come back into the kill zone, searching the ruins, searching the ditches, looking for the orphan who had saved their lives. They lifted him up. The pain was excruciating as the blood started to move again, but Francis didn't feel it. He just felt the hands of his brothers. We got you, Francis, one of them sobbed. We got you, buddy. You're going home. Francis Curry blacked out. When he woke up, he was in a clean bed. The sheets were white. The air smelled of antiseptic. He was in a hospital in England. The doctors told him he was lucky. He had severe frostbite. He had a concussion. He had shrapnel wounds in his legs. He had lost 20 pounds. But he was alive. Francis didn't feel lucky. He felt guilty. He felt like he had just done his job. He spent months recovering. The war in Europe ended. The Nazis surrendered. The King Tigers were turned into scrap metal. In July 1945, Francis was ordered to report to a stadium in Germany. He didn't know why. He thought it was a routine assembly. He stood in formation, his uniform hanging loosely on his skinny frame. He looked like a gust of wind could blow him over. A car pulled up. Flags waved. A band played. Major General Leland Hobbs stepped out. He walked down the line of soldiers. He stopped in front of Francis Curry. The general looked at the boy. He looked at the citation in his hand. He looked back at the boy. Sergeant Curry, the general said. His voice boomed over the loudspeakers. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The general read the list: the tank, the 3 half-tracks, the rescue of 5 men, the single-handed defense of the bridge at Malmedy. The thousands of soldiers in the stadium went silent. They listened to the impossible numbers. They looked at the small, unassuming kid standing there. The general stepped forward. He placed a blue ribbon around Francis's neck. the Medal of Honor. Francis stood at attention. He saluted. He didn't smile. He was thinking about the ditch. He was thinking about the cold. A reporter snapped a photo. In that picture, Francis Curry doesn't look like a warrior. He looks like a confused teenager who wandered onto a movie set. But that image, the skinny boy with the highest honor, became the definition of American resolve. Francis went home, but he didn't go home to glory. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He didn't run for office. He didn't write a book about how he won the war. He went back to being Francis. He moved to New York. He got a job as a counselor for the Veterans Administration. For the next 30 years, he sat in a small office, listening to other men talk about their nightmares. He helped them find jobs. He helped them get health care. Most of the men he helped had no idea who he was. They didn't know that the quiet man behind the desk, the one who listened so patiently, was the ghost of Malmedy. Francis never told them. He knew that the medal around his neck didn't make him better than them. It just meant he survived. In his spare time, he gardened. He grew tomatoes. He fixed fences. He lived the quiet life that the orphanage had prepared him for. He died in 2019. He was 94 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of the Bulge. When he died, they buried him with full military honors. But on his tombstone, it doesn't list his kill count. It doesn't list the tanks he destroyed. It just lists his name and his rank. Because Francis Curry taught us something important. We live in a world that is obsessed with power. We look for heroes who are strong, who are loud, who are invincible. We look for supermen. But real history isn't written by supermen. It's written by orphans. It's written by farm boys. It's written by the quiet ones who are terrified, who are freezing, who are out of ammo, and who stand up anyway. Francis Curry proved that strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. It's about the refusal to accept that the math is against you. On December 18, 1944, the German army brought a tank to a knife fight. But Francis Curry brought something stronger. He brought the grit of a man who had nothing left to lose. And that made him the most dangerous man in the world. If this story of the underdog who broke the German war machine inspired you, please hit the like button. It helps us dig up more of these forgotten legends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of the heroes who walked quietly among us. History is full of missing pages. We are here to write them back in. Thanks for watching.